Welcome everyone, my name is Robies and today I bring you a new episode of Assassin's Creed The Real History, the series where I compare the representations of characters, factions, events, and locations depicted within one of the Assassin's Creed games to their actual history. I apologize in advance for the delay in making this episode, but I was busy gathering all the required footage from the new titles. Anyways, please be warned of major story spoilers ahead. To begin our foray into Unity, I thought it only proper to start with one of the most world-renowned military leaders of all time, Napoléon Bonaparte. To start, I will share with you some of his background information as we cover his pre-game history, then we will cover his appearances within Assassin's Creed Unity with his in-game history, and lastly we will analyze the differences between how he was represented in the game to his actual life. Napoleone di Bonaparte, as he was christened, was born on August 15, 1769 in the town of Ajaccio, Corsica, to Carlo Maria di Bonaparte and Maria Letizia Ramolino, descendants of minor Italian nobles. Napoleone's father served as an attorney and Corsica's representative to the court of Louis XVI in 1777. Raised as a strict Catholic, Napoleone received a great education in France where he became fluent in the language because of his parents' high social standing. In 1779, he joined the military academy at Brienne-le-Château and after graduating was admitted to the very elite École Militaire in Paris where he trained as an artillery officer. Following the death of his father, the young man's income was reduced and therefore he was forced to complete a 2-year education in a single year. Succeeding, despite still speaking French with a Corsican accent, Napoleone became the first Corsican to graduate from l'École Militaire. He soon after adopted the more French-sounding Napoléon Bonaparte. Serving as an artillery officer from 1785 to 1789, Napoleon took 2 years leave from military service when the revolution broke out, and stayed in Corsica and Paris in the time. Back home in Corsica, he supported the Jacobin Club and was promoted to lieutenant colonel in the Corsican militia. Even though he defied the French army in this time by leading riots, he was eventually promoted as captain in the French army in later 1792. It would have been around this point where we first met Napoleon as a military officer during the events of the insurrection of August 10, 1792. Historically speaking, as he was stationed in Paris at the time, Napoleon witnessed the mobilization of the angry mob and how they attacked the Swiss guards defending the Tuileries, and it is said that this event really marked him. Assassin's Creed Unity took it even further, having Napoleon sneak into the Tuileries beforehand, telling Arnaud that he was not there officially and that he would claim to have seen the events from across the street, since he was really there to look through the king's things to locate any state secrets or private correspondences. Although this meeting was fictional, it added a great twist to the history. Back in the real history, in 1793, after publishing a pro-Republican pamphlet named Le Souper de Beaucaire, Napoleon gained the respect of Robespierre's younger brother, which later helped him secure the position of artillery commander and the duty of ousting the invading British troops in the city of Toulon. Using his expertise in artillery, he succeeded and was promoted to the position of brigadier general at the age of 24. Using his connections, he later offered the Jacobins some military insights on foreign battles, which won them victories and rewarded Napoleon with the command of the French troops and artillery in Italy. Following the arrest and execution of Robespierre, Napoleon was temporarily held in custody where his loyalties were checked. Although historians are still somewhat undecided on how he convinced his captors to release him, it is generally accepted that he was freed within 2 weeks, returning to his position where he prepared attacks against the Italians to aid in France's war against Austria. Napoleon was later engaged to Désiré Cléry, who came from a wealthy merchant family and whose sister was married to his older brother. In October 1795, the royalist forces in Paris began a rebellion against the National Convention and the leaders of the Thermidorien reaction. Due to his abilities, Napoleon was enlisted to defend the Tuileries Palace so that the massacre of the Paris Commune, which he witnessed 3 years earlier, would not be repeated. As was briefly shown in Unity, using large cannons and strategic troop placements, Napoleon defeated the royalists who outnumbered him 6-1, killing approximately 1,400 before the rest retreated. It is this event which later inspired the term that Napoleon had cleared the streets with a whiff of grape shot. For crushing the royalists, Napoleon quickly became famous and wealthy, while also taking command of the entire French army in Italy. In this new social standing, he met Joséphine de Beauharnais, who he later married on March 9, 1796, after ending his engagement with Désiré Cléry. 2 days after the wedding, Bonaparte left Paris and took command of the French forces in Italy, leading them to many victories despite Austrian resistance, using his great planning abilities, espionage, and deception. This eventually led to a forced peace treaty for Austria in 1797, giving France control of northern Italy, Venice, and the Low Countries. In this time, Napoleon even argued against the removal of the Pope, since he foresaw more negative repercussions than positive ones for these actions. At this point, he became more politically engaged, creating a newspaper for the troops and the general population. Although some claimed he wanted a dictatorship, these royalists were soon silenced and Bonaparte then re-established the Republican government, which, at the time, was very dependent on his choices. Napoleon's next military action was in Egypt, through which he hoped to reach India with the goal of making an alliance with the Tipu Sultan, so to cut English access to the Indian trade routes and make them accessible to the French. This 1798 expedition included over 100 scientists from the French Academy of Sciences who made many great discoveries, including the Rosetta Stone, while they were abroad. This campaign encompassed many conflicts with the local Mamluks, including the Battle of the Pyramids, where 25,000 French troops defeated an equal force with less than 100 casualties, and the conflict in Jaffa, where 1,400 prisoners of war were executed by bayonets or drowned to preserve ammunition. Unfortunately, despite these successes, the Mediterranean was controlled by the British fleet under Horatio Nelson, which kept the French at bay. Napoleon returned to Paris in 1799 as France began losing the War of the Second Coalition. When he arrived, the tide had turned for France, but the government had bankrupted the country and was unpopular with the people. Despite his actions in Egypt, Napoleon was considered a French hero, and on November 9, 1799, he used this to overthrow the Directory by a coup d'etat and made himself the first consul of France. A new constitution was written and rewritten, then voted in by the population, creating on the surface a new French republic, but in reality what many assumed was a military dictatorship with Napoleon at its head. This claim was based on the fact that the vote was apparently 99.94% in favor of the new regime. Afterwards, Napoleon returned to Italy and defeated the Austrians, forcing a peace treaty where they came under French rule. In March of 1802, the Treaty of Amiens was signed and there was a temporary peace between England and France. Napoleon then re-established slavery in French colonies, sparking the Haitian Revolution, which he failed to quell when his troops were infected with yellow fever. Next, instead of potentially losing some colonies to the British in a war he foresaw, Bonaparte solved France's recent bankruptcy by selling these colonies to the United States under the terms of the Louisiana Purchase. Between 1800 and 1804, the Royalists and Jacobins tried to have Napoleon killed through multiple assassination attempts. The two most prominent were the Conspiration des Poignards and the plot of the Rue Saint-Nicaise, the second of which was featured as a co-op mission in Assassin's Creed Unity. Although the game fictionalized the elements that there were snipers involved, the main plot, prepared by the Royalists, would have had a cart with gunpowder-filled barrels, which they called the Machine Infernale, explode as Napoleon's carriage went by the same road where he massacred the Royalists while defending the Tuileries. What actually happened was that the signal was given too late, and although the Machine Infernale did explode and kill and injure many, Napoleon was not one of the victims. Eventually, a member of the former Bourbon royalty was captured and blamed for inspiring these attempts, for which he was executed. Using these attacks as justification, Napoleon created a hereditary monarchy in France, making himself emperor. He was crowned Emperor Napoleon I on December 2, 1804 at the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. It was even arranged so Napoleon would take the crown from the Pope's hands at the last minute to crown himself so that he could signify that he was not subjected to papal authority. On May 26, 1805, he was crowned King of Italy at the Milan Cathedral. Soon after, the War of the Third Coalition took place, where an alliance of England, Austria, and Russia declared war on France. This war contained many battles, both on land and sea, ultimately ending with Bonaparte's victory at the Battle of Austerlitz, ending the Third Coalition. After securing an alliance with the Ottoman Empire, the War of the Fourth Coalition soon followed, where France gained most of the Prussian territory and part of the Russian lands. Despite a large dominance of European lands, Napoleon was unable to secure the seas from British control. In 1808, the Peninsular War in Spain began, where the Spanish resisted French control with guerrilla warfare, supported by the British and Portuguese, and ending with a French defeat in 1814. At the same time, in 1809, Austria broke its alliance with France, starting the War of the Fifth Coalition, where the Austrians were defeated and the Papal States were annexed for refusing to support Bonaparte's continent-wide regime. In reason of this, Pope Pius VII excommunicated Napoleon, for which he was subsequently kidnapped by one of the emperor's officers. The Pope was moved around the empire, imprisoned, until he would sign an agreement with France, which he refused to do. In 1810, Napoleon divorced Josephine as she did not produce him an heir, and married the Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria, further straining his relationship with the Church. His son, Napoleon François Joseph Charles Bonaparte, was born on March 20, 1811, and the emperor even allowed Josephine to remain empress as he did still love her. For not attending his second wedding, Napoleon imprisoned 13 cardinals and kept the Pope in jail for 5 years until the pontiff was freed by Allied forces and returned to Rome. Despite a Franco-Russian alliance existing, by 1812 war was brewing, and Napoleon led 450,000 men to begin the invasion of Russia, also known as the Second Polish War. Despite the French military superiority, the Russians continued to retreat and fought many smaller conflicts. As they fought for Moscow, the French won with high casualties, but the Russians simply burned the city and kept retreating. Knowing the size of Russia and that this conflict may never end, while also fearing for the safety of France, Napoleon ordered a retreat. Doing so during the winter, however, was costly to his army, and when they returned to France, the army had only a tenth of their original numbers remaining, while the Russians had lost 150,000 soldiers and hundreds of thousands of civilians over the fighting. In 1813, the emperor raised another army of 350,000 troops, but due to his failure in Russia, he was challenged by Austria, Russia, Great Britain, Prussia, Spain, and Portugal in the War of the Sixth Coalition. Being outnumbered and following many defeats with few victories in between, Paris was captured by the coalition in March of 1814, and on April 2nd, Napoleon was deposed as emperor. With the Treaty of Fontainebleau signed, Napoleon was exiled to the island of Elba in the Mediterranean off the Tuscan coast. He was allowed to keep his title of emperor and ruled the island of 12,000 inhabitants. Napoleon attempted suicide by swallowing a pill he had carried with him since the Russian campaign, however it had weakened with age and he survived. With rumors soon spreading that he may be banished to a remote island in the Atlantic Ocean, Napoleon escaped from Elba on February 26, 1815, and landed at the Gulf Juan in France 2 days later. He was intercepted by the 5th Regiment, who were sent by the new government on March 7, 1815, south of Grenoble. All alone and within gunshot range, Napoleon dismounted his horse and yelled, "Here I am, kill your emperor if you wish." The soldiers responded with "Vive l'Empereur" and joined him, marching upon Paris, where the newly established King Louis XVIII fled. Once back, Napoleon governed for a period known as the 100 Days, while Great Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia prepared troops to challenge him. Napoleon's forces fought the Allied armies, ultimately culminating in the Battle of Waterloo on June 18, 1815. The French forces were defeated, and returning to Paris, the government and people turned against him. He abdicated his position once again on June 22nd, giving his son the leadership of France. He settled at Malmaison, with the coalition forces soon after entering France and restoring King Louis XVIII. Because the coalition wanted him dead, he fled, intending to reach the United States. However, he was blocked by the British Navy. He then formally demanded asylum from the British captain Frederick Maitland on July 15, 1815. An agreement was made, and he was imprisoned and then exiled to the island of St. Helena in the Atlantic Ocean. His time on St. Helena was peaceful, however he constantly hoped for freedom should a new party take power. Multiple plans were set up by various factions to return Napoleon as leader, but none of them were successful. As his health deteriorated, Napoleon passed away on May 5, 1821 from what was later confirmed to be stomach cancer. However, some theorized that he may have been poisoned. In 1840, his remains were returned to France by command of Louis-Philippe I. In summary, there were a few differences between Napoleon's in-game depiction and his real history. First, he was not actually within the Tuileries Palace during the events of the insurrection of August 10, 1792, but instead witnessed it from the outside, which truly left an impression on him as a military and political figure. Secondly, although Napoleon never had a conflict with an officer named Frédéric Rouille during the September massacres, the way he handled the situation by referring to him as a thorn in his side that had not been plucked yet was truly representative of his rise in military prowess. Thirdly, although the plot of the Rue de Saint-Nicaise was well represented in the game, evidently the assassins were not involved in Napoleon's survival and there were no snipers in addition to the Machine Infernale. Although Napoleon only appeared a few times in Assassin's Creed Unity, his personality and behavior were a great interpretation of the historical figure, and the way in which they elaborated on already known historical information to further implicate his story with that of the assassins made for some really great scenes. Therefore, even though there were minor changes made to his history to connect him to Arnaud's story, Napoleon's scenes and overall representation in the game were very memorable. With that final fact, we have finished another episode of Assassin's Creed: The Real History. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and if you did, I highly recommend you try one of the Assassin's Creed games. Thank you all for watching. Please leave any suggestions for future characters, groups, events, or locations from any of the Assassin's Creed games, now including Unity and Rogue, that you'd like me to cover in the comment section below. Please rate, comment, and subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you all in a future historical episode.